talking last time about the tail end of wine processing, with the tartrate stabilization being the last item of discussion. We mentioned that ion exchange and cold refrigeration and filtration were the two major methods of tartrate stabilization. Now I'd like to talk a bit about aging effects in wine, and it blends nicely with tartrate stabilization because at one time aging did accomplish much of what was necessary in tartrate stabilization. Remember, we said that the cream of tartar precipitates slowly from the wine, and of course if you're going to age it, this gives it plenty of time to precipitate. So a lot of things that were accomplished simply by aging and were not very well understood can now be accomplished by quicker methods, and tartrate stabilization is one of these things. That makes tartrate stabilization sort of a quick aging procedure, if you like, although as soon as it's identified and separated out, then no longer do people consider it a quick aging procedure. Of course, it makes a difference how aging is done, whether it would relate to tartrate stabilization. So in Europe, where the weather was cold in the winter and the wine would be stored in a rather cold condition, obviously that would aid tartrate stabilization, whereas in much of California or in an ice cave where the temperature is cool but not very cold, then the stability of the tartrate might still be inadequate for lower temperatures, as might occur during refrigeration by the customer or something of this sort. In any case, aging has several aspects of importance and possible utility. On the other hand, aging is very expensive. If for no other reason aging is expensive, because you have the capital tied up in the wine, so that you have your money in the wine, and if you can't sell it, that means that you must get interest on your money or it isn't worth doing. At least it's expensive to do. So for instance, if you can get 5% or 6% on your savings at a bank or savings and loan, obviously you expect to get at least that much if you're going to tie your capital up in wine and have to increase the price, then compounded interest at 5 or 6% just to break even, and maybe 7% or 8% if you're going to have to borrow the money to stay in business, because it's certainly going to cost you that much or more. Obviously then you must get a considerable price increase for your wine to justify aging, at least beyond the minimum. And there are other reasons why you must get considerable price increase. There is evaporation. If you're aging in wooden containers particularly, there is some evaporation through the side of the container, and as a consequence you're going to lose. The government allows a loss of, I believe it's 2% a year without any questions, and if you can justify it, up to I think it's 4% a year. So there's another, say on the average of 3% of loss that you're going to incur just by evaporation and a certain amount of spillage as you transfer the wine and this sort of thing. Then, in addition to these factors, obviously there are going to be hazard factors. You might have an accident in the winery, somebody might bump a valve and it'd leak all night, this kind of thing, and the longer you keep the wine, obviously the greater chance of loss. For all these reasons then, and recently there was still another, and that was an inventory tax. I believe the inventory tax in California has now been removed on wine or other products that are still considered in process, but it's only recently that that's so. Up till quite recently, on the 1st of March, you had to pay a tax on all the wine that you had stored. So if, and tax was not inconsiderable. It was a certain percentage of the estimated value. So that for all these reasons, there was great pressure on the winemaker not to age the wine, get it on the market as soon as possible. He got his money, he avoided the necessity of raising the price, and he saved these extra costs. That pressure still exists, although at least as far as the tax goes, it's been eased a little bit. So generally speaking, the wine would be aged the minimum to produce the product that's considered satisfactory by the particular winery, and that would of course vary by winery and by product. If more age is needed, the customer may give more age himself, or the wholesaler, retailer may also, either inadvertently just in holding the wine until it's sold, or on purpose in some instances. However, they're pretty much limited to age in bottle, and the winery is the only one that can effectively do much about aging in barrel, so that there are roughly these two kinds of aging. aging in cooperage, and the term cooperage we haven't used, I don't think, before. Perhaps I should mention what it means. The word cooper is a man who makes barrels, a man who makes wooden barrels. So cooperage on the face of it would imply wooden containers. However, by usage in the winery, we mean now all bulk containers for wine. So stainless steel tanks or redwood tanks or oak barrels would all be included in cooperage. So we'd have aging in cooperage and then aging in bottle as the two distinct types of aging. They are distinct because particularly in the wooden barrel you have extractives from the oak, and the smaller wooden containers would always be oak, and or extractives from redwood, which might be true in the bigger containers. As well as evaporation through the sides. You don't get evaporation through the side of a stainless steel tank, but you would through the side of a wooden container. So that the effects would be quite different. And if your intent is to deliberately mature the wine in oak containers, they would, the maturation is much more effective at this stage in wood than in stainless steel. If you try to do the same thing in stainless steel, then you're going to need some wood extract, which you can produce by adding wood chips to the wine, for example, and you may need some extra oxidation, because in the holding in wooden containers, there is an opportunity for some oxidation, limited, and it should be very little, but some limited oxidation to occur as the ullage develops. Obviously, you're not going to fill up the wine every day. There will be a little airspace at the top. There will be some opportunity for air contact. And since you do rack and process the wine periodically, there is going to be some air pickup in the course of racking and so forth. So in aging in cooperage, there is some oxidation that occurs. There is some difference of opinion as to how much of it is desirable. Certainly a limited amount, if any, is desirable. There's some belief that none is, as near as we can approach none, is good. Whether or not we ever come very close to none, we can't quite reach zero oxidation, and so oxidation is a part of storage in wooden containers or in cooperage. Whereas in the bottle, in contrast, the wine is essentially sealed if it's properly capped and handled, and you want zero oxidation. Now, with long storage in bottle, there's going to be gradually some leakage of oxygen in, and to the extent this occurs, it's apt to then spoil the wine. So eventually, the wine will go bad in the bottle, no matter what kind of wine. So you can't, it would be lovely to have a 2000 BC bottle of wine, but it wouldn't be any good, obviously. The oldest wine that I've ever tasted that was still good was in 1897, however, and it was still quite nice, so that it is possible for wine to survive a long time in bottle if the closure remains intact. However, if the closure, whether it's screw cap or cork, begins to leak a little more than it should, then that hurries the change of the wine and spoilage and loss. So we speak of a very old wine as being, quote, over the hill, and it might be well worth thinking about this a little bit. If this is time and this is quality, we would think that, say, it starts at a good quality and it increases slowly with time. We may be talking about years, and at some point it doesn't increase much any further, and then at some further point it will go, quote, over the hill and become rapidly decreased in quality. And the point I want to make is that the rate of decrease once it begins is rather sudden, and so that you may be waiting along here not getting much change, and then you wait a little bit too long and rapidly you will be sorry you waited any further. So that generally speaking, for the people who appreciate aged wine, you would expect to have a total time of not over the order of 12 years, and depending on the kind of wine, perhaps a good deal less. You run the risk from that point on of getting into bad troubles, but again, this depends somewhat on the wine, and certain wines like vintage port, for example, may stand very well 20 years in the bottle and still be improving. So it's hard to make generalizations, but it's fairly unimportant, because the economics of the situation make the value of the wine go up just due to economics, whether or not the quality in the bottle has improved a great deal. So you may have read recently about auctions where individual bottles of wine sold from, I think the high value now up to around $6,000 a bottle. Obviously, I didn't bid on that, at least not in the later stages, and I doubt if very many in the room would either. Clearly, you're running a big risk that for your $6,000, you get a bottle of wine that's too old and not as good as something that was a good deal younger. What do we expect to happen during this aging? Why worry about it? Why to go to all this trouble and expense? Well, there are a number of things that happen during aging that are quite desirable. And first of all, there is a tendency to lose harsh or so-called green flavors. The green flavors are apt to be related to yeastiness. So as the yeastiness diminishes with time, this would be a desirable effect. And the harshnesses, a slightly extra bitter character, perhaps if it's a fortified wine, the more alcoholic character. All of these harshnesses tend to diminish with time, so the wine becomes more mellow and smoother and less harsh. In addition to that, the wine tends to get more complex, and a complex flavor is more aesthetically pleasing than a simple flavor. If you don't quite grasp what I'm saying, you might think of, suppose you made green bean casserole. It might not taste too great, but if you put in a pinch of rosemary and a pinch of oregano and 4 or 5 other things, it might taste pretty good by the time you got through, providing you didn't put a handful of rosemary in or do something that completely overbalanced the flavor. So the good cook is the one that uses a restrained touch but adds little nuances of flavor that together make the dish seem very interesting and complex. And the same thing applies to wine. We don't want big changes in flavor so that you say, oh yes, well they have done thus and so to the wine. What we want is something that you say, my, I wonder what they did to the wine, you see, so that it's a restrained kind of complexity. I might make an analogy to music. You can think of a piccolo solo. It might play the, 1812 overture on a piccolo, and it might not sound very pleasing. But the same thing with the cannons and full symphony orchestra and so on, sounds pretty exciting. So that the complexity has to do with this kind of thing. The more kinds of flavor and the interrelation among them without any one sort of flavor being too outstanding. And then, of course, the third, so losing harshness, gaining complexity, and then the third thing we want to do is to retain as much of the original grape quality and wine quality as possible. So the fruity aromas and so forth we'd like to keep. Now, that doesn't always work. Sometimes or almost invariably, the fruitinesses and the fresh character that is desirable in a young wine diminishes as you gain these other features. As a consequence, you can visualize 2 styles of wine, pretty much. You have what I call the fresh, fruity, or picnic style of wine, as opposed to the mature, complex dinner style of wine. So that a winery can decide to go either way, and partly because of young people's interest, and generally young people tend to like the fresh, fruity types of wine, I believe, and Americans in general, I think, tend to like this. There's been a great movement in our wine industry toward the fresh, fruity, and less expensive type of wine, as opposed to the mellow and more mature and more expensive types of wine. I hope it doesn't ever go so far as we lose both kinds. I think it's inevitable that the complex types are going to cost more and therefore perhaps appeal to people with more money, but they are very good, and it would be nice if everybody appreciated both kinds so that there remains this broad market, as I think it will remain, for both styles and, of course, intermediate forms of the two. The aging that is considered desirable is variable by wine. So, for instance, for dry red table wine, the premium table wines, the ones bringing the higher prices, you would expect that they would have from 1 to 3 years in oak cooperage, probably 50-gallon barrels. And they would probably improve for some 5 to 10 years in bottle. So that if we add those together, 3 and 10 would be 13. They might be improving for a total of 13 years. Now, that means if the wine is vintage dated, and we're buying it today, 1973, then you'd expect it to say 1960 on the label for its maximum character. And if you've looked at wine shops recently, you don't find very much 1960 wine on red table wine on the market. So that means that most of the wines have not had what is considered to be optimum age. Some of them may have had the 1 to 3 years in barrel. A good many may have if they're premium products. But they expect you then, if you want it to be kept that long in the bottle, to buy it early and keep it. And you'll save a good deal of money if you do. Of course, your capital will be tied up too, but at least it will be improving. And if you like the aged character, this is the way to get it, I think. Don't depend on a supplier. You'll pay a great deal for it. Rather, do your own bottle aging. In the course of bottle aging, which I haven't said much about, I guess, there is the development of a special character called bottle bouquet. And you'll hear later on that we divide aromas, are those flavors that come from the grape and the fruit that is made into the wine. Whereas bouquet are those odors that come from the processing and aging of the wine. So a bottle bouquet implies an age change then, as opposed to grape aroma. The bottle bouquet is an odor that is difficult to describe until you've recognized it yourself. At least in white wines, it's a little easier to recognize, and it is found there as well. I tend to describe it as an odor that reminds me of sun-dried laundry. So you know how good, nice, clean clothes smell if you put your face in a crumpled up nice sheet right off the line. Well, it's kind of like that maybe. At least it is very attractive and pleasant, and it gives you some idea of the kind of odor that you might be looking for. And won't find in inexpensive young wines unless you keep them yourself, and even then the young wine is probably not made to withstand aging. And this is another point, particularly for the dry red table wines. You would make the wines differently if you expected them to be aged, and we'll talk briefly about this later, or at least you'll see why. But the main difference is you would ferment a shorter time on the skins, meaning the wine then would be less tannic as a rule if you don't intend to age it, and more tannic if you do intend to age it. The dry white table wines would perhaps not be aged in wood at all, so that depending again on the style, the white wines tend to be over-oxidized very easily, and it doesn't take very much oak extract or wood extract to overbalance the flavor. So for this reason, many dry white wines, even the premium ones, may never be aged in wood, although some may be, and it depends on the type. Chardonnay, for example, is more apt to be aged in wood than other white wines. And you will find that generally up to 1 year is about all the wood age that you'd expect to get, or you would use large containers rather than small containers. This point may not be obvious. If you use a large container as compared to a small one, obviously, if you think of surface to volume relationships, there's more square feet of wood per gallon of contents in the little one than there is in the big one. So in the little one, we might have, say, 1 square foot of, if you had a 1-gallon keg, you'd have probably over a square foot of oak surface per gallon of contents, and if you had a 3,000-gallon oak tank, you'd have down to a fraction, maybe a tenth of a square foot per gallon. So obviously the evaporative effects and the oak extract effects and so on would be affected by the container size. For this reason, if you're going to age white wines in wooden containers, you're likely to use larger ones and or a shorter time than for red table wines where you'd want more effect. And then the rosé wines would be, pink wines would tend to be like white, although since there is less of a history of pink wines, it's even more likely that the pink wines will not be aged for any appreciable length of time. So the pink wines almost universally are best when they're sold as a fresh, fruity, grapey product and not aged, whereas white and red may be good either way, and a particular product you may emphasize one or the other style. Dessert and appetizer wines are quite variable. They range from 0 to 20 years in wood, and probably 1 or whatever the minimum time is in bottle to 20 years or so in bottle. Usually not the same. I don't know of any wine that's kept 20 years in wood and 20 years in bottle. Usually if it's kept short in wood, it's kept longer in bottle, such as in vintage ports, which you'll hear more about, or the other way around. If it's kept a long time in wood, then there isn't much point in trying to get changes in bottle. So that things like tawny ports or sherries generally don't do much good in bottle, so that they're only kept long enough to get them where you want them and keep them long enough for you to enjoy consuming them. when you want to, convenience rather than change in bottle. The clarification of wine, another step now, leaving aging. Clarification can be done a number of ways. We've already mentioned sedimentation and racking, which is done generally several times in the life of each wine. Each time the wine is transferred, it should be racked from the sediment. A second method is fining, and fining comes from the same origin as refine. It means to finish or to make fine. And fining is done in wine with fining agents, and the fining agents are materials that, when added to wine, will produce a flocculent, do you know the word flocculent? A fluffy type of precipitate, and then this precipitate will settle through the wine, and being net-like and fluffy, it will entrap and take with it a lot of the incipient haze materials. So by using a fining agent, you can clarify a wine of particles that that would not settle out by themselves and might not even be possible to filter. So that fining would be a good way of clarifying wines, particularly those that may be difficult to clarify. Fining agents are often proteins like gelatin or casein or egg albumin, and at one time even blood. Any proteinaceous agent can be added and will precipitate out of the wine. So the one that's easiest to understand, I suppose, is egg white. Take egg whites, whip them up with a little wine, pour this into the main batch of wine, and if you can see into the container, you'll find that it forms a flocculent precipitate which settles out. The egg white doesn't remain in the wine. It precipitates and brings with it these hazy and likely to become hazy materials. Other types of fining agents besides proteins would include certain minerals, particularly bentonite. Bentonite is a mineral that gets its name, bentonite, from Fort Benton in Wyoming. If you've ever gone up through Wyoming, you come fairly close to Fort Benton, and bentonite is a mineral that is mined in that region and a few other regions of the world, but perhaps the best bentonite is from Wyoming, and a lot of European wines are fined with Wyoming bentonite. This mineral is a slimy clay-like material that when wet is very flocculent again and very swells a great deal. I don't know what happens to the area if it ever rains around Fort Benton. The ground probably rises about 4 feet, because when you put a teaspoonful of bentonite that's dry into a glass of wine, it fills the glass almost half full in a hurry. Maybe that's a little exaggeration, but it does swell up a great deal. And this flocculent material then is a good adsorbent, particularly for proteins. So if you're having trouble with proteinaceous hazes in wine, as can be the case in certain white wines, bentonite is probably the best agent, and it's one of the most commonly used. Then there are other kinds of fining agents. Certain plastics are used these days. Nylon, for instance, has been used, although it is not commonly. And these will help remove tannins and other agents that might cause hazes. The clarification can also be by either filtration or centrifugation, using a centrifuge which whirls the wine and gets the gravity very high, so settling is hastened, and filtration through either a rough or fine filtering medium. We do have filtrations that are so fine that will even remove at least yeast cells and, under some circumstances, bacterial cells. So you can have what's called sterile filtrations. And this is the best way and the least damaging to wine to produce a sterile wine. If you filter the wine so closely that no microorganism can be on the other side of the filter, obviously it is going to be sterile, and then no further microbial spoilage can occur as long as it doesn't get contaminated again. So those are the clarification methods that we'd commonly use. How about pasteurization? I think I've mentioned that Pasteur developed pasteurization as a treatment for wine and beer, not for milk, although we tend to think of it as a milk treatment here. Pasteurization is a heat treatment, but a restrained type of heat treatment so that you get minimal chemical change in the product and still are able to kill the microorganisms. So ordinarily, a proper pasteurization is a relatively high temperature for a very short time. For instance, 1 minute at 180 degrees Fahrenheit would be a rather good type of so-called flash pasteurization. If you don't get it that hot, you have to hold the wine longer, and then there's more change in the wine. So that ideally, very hot, but very short times. Now, how do you accomplish, say you had 3,000 gallons of wine, how can you heat it to 180 degrees for a minute? That's pretty hard to do, you might think. Well, it is rather difficult. What you do is use a heat exchanger. You run the wine through a pipe into a apparatus that has plates that divide hot water or steam from the wine, and the wine circulates back and forth without mixing with the steam or water, picking up the heat from the source of heat. Then the next unit can be the same sort of thing, but with cold water, or better yet, cold wine. The wine that's going to go through the heat exchanger then can be used to cool the exit wine. So by doing this sort of heat exchanging, you can get the wine very hot, hold it for a very brief time, and then cool it again. And this is what we'd like to do if we pasteurize the wine. Now, a good processor may not find it necessary, and in fact, most premium wines are not pasteurized because the feeling is that it is apt to damage the quality. It may be possible under ideal conditions to produce very good wine without damaging the flavor, but it does take ideal conditions, and if you have a very expensive, very high quality wine that's been handled properly, it should not be necessary to pasteurize the wine, in which case you're safer and you're sure the quality won't be damaged by the heating. When we do use pasteurization, we might even use something that's referred to as hot bottling. Hot bottling means just heating up the wine, filling it into the bottles, and letting it cool slowly in the bottle. Now, obviously, that exaggerates the heat damage, and since it's apt to be gallon jug wine that is treated this way, the gallon jug takes quite a while to cool, and so that oftentimes the wine that has had this kind of heat treatment is changed at least. It might be conceivable you'd like that change, but generally speaking, we would consider that the flavor is likely to be damaged by such treatment. The only time that pasteurization becomes critical and a problem is if you're trying to make a slightly sweet table wine. A typical dry table wine where all the sugar has been fermented and the yeast can no longer ferment then because there's no sugar there for them that they can use. This sort of thing is easy to make stable without any pasteurization or other treatment. If, on the other hand, you're trying to meet the taste of many Americans for a slightly sweet table wine, then you must have some sugar present for it to taste slightly sweet, and then you run considerable risk. Remember, we said there are nearly always some living yeast. You run considerable risk that these living yeast will begin to ferment in the bottle. If they do, then you're going to have cloudy wine, gassy wine, and the wine will not sell well or be returned to you at a loss. So that this is a problem, and some way of keeping the wine microbially stable so the yeast and other organisms won't grow is important, and in this case you may find it necessary to either use sterile filtration, which is the more elegant procedure, or pasteurization, or possibly certain kinds of additives. However, the additives are under fire, and most of them are not terribly effective or else produce off flavors, so that generally speaking we would like not to use additives to keep the microorganisms from growing. Blending is still another operation of considerable use. You can correct deficiencies by blending. If you have a wine that's too low in acid and have another that's high in acid or even too high in acid, then you can make a better wine by putting the two together. So you can correct deficiencies and you can ensure uniformity. But more importantly, you can make better wine because you can make it more complex. We said that complexity was a quality value of importance, and you can visualize that if you had a wine, say, that was a little high in oakiness, it might not be so good. It might be defective because it was high in oakiness, but if you could add that to a bunch of wine that is not, a batch of wine that is not oaky, needs some oakiness, then again the complexity would be a positive value and would be worth doing. So those are the main three reasons that you might do blending. In making a blend, you should make a pre-test small-scale blend, taste it and analyze it to see that if you've accomplished what you want to do, be sure your measurements are accurate so you can repeat it, keep records, and then when you've finally decided, and this is one of the most demanding jobs, usually the most senior or most experienced man has the final word on the blending. Once you've decided on the blend based on laboratory tests, then you say, okay, put that 3,000 gallons and this 2 million gallons together or whatever, and you can see why it's a very demanding and experience requiring job, because you can't take them apart once they're put together, and if you make a mistake, it can't be corrected. Ordinarily, before bottling the wine, after blending, you would allow a short period of time, which is often spoken of as a marrying period, and maybe not terribly short, might be as much as 6 months, because when you mix two flavor-bearing solutions, then they do interact to some extent, and the chemical changes may actually change the flavor from what you expected to get. So ordinarily, you wouldn't bottle it immediately. You would wait a period of time to make sure the flavor had stabilized and was the way you wanted it, and before you decided no further treatment was necessary, and you would bottle. There are types of fractional blending to produce a particularly uniform product, and you'll be hearing about fractional blending under the Solera system with Spanish sherry later on. So then the wine at this stage should be ready for marketing. You would probably go through a final polishing filtration. You'd make the wine as brilliantly clear as you could by a final polishing and or sterile filtration. Probably add a small amount of sulfur dioxide to counteract the air that would be picked up during bottling, or make sure that the bottles are filled with CO2 or nitrogen or some inert gas before wine is put in, so that there isn't any air carried into the bottle with the wine. Fill the bottle from the bottom up with as little splashing as you possibly can so it doesn't pick up air. Close the bottle, usually with a cork if it's a premium wine, with a screw cap if it's not, and make sure that this closure is one that doesn't let air in readily. This is why when you bottle age, you keep the wine lying down. You want the cork to stay wet. If it does not, if it dries out, then air will readily penetrate a dry cork, and or the cork will get loose, and perhaps then when you tip the bottle over again, it will leak, or even the cork might fall out. So the corks, at least, should always be kept wet by the, and you may or may not have noticed if you buy a case of wine or see a case of wine in a wine shop, usually if you read the label on the case and it's sitting so you can read it right side up, so to speak, and you open it, you'll find the bottoms of the bottles so that they're ordinarily cased so that when the case is handled with the writing visible, the tops will be down to make sure the corks stay wet. And with this kind of subterfuge, and for instance, if you want to know a good wine shop, generally speaking, if you see a wine shop where all the bottles are sitting up straight, it's not a good place to buy wine, because clearly the man doesn't understand wine, and the ones where they're lying down enough that the corks stay wet would be a good hint that at least he has read a little bit about wine and knows something about how they ought to be handled. The bottle may be aged in the winery. If so, it's generally referred to as binning. The wines will be stacked up in the bottles in bins, and therefore binning. And then after the desired period of bottle age, which, to be honest, is relatively short in the average winery today, ordinarily then the wine would be labeled, the capsule would be put on to cover the cork, and whatever other dress is used applied, the bottles cased up and sent to market. Today, much of the bottle aging is done in cases. The wines are labeled and cased and then held in the storage warehouse for a period of time, and you would watch for leakers. If any case shows any evidence of one bottle having broken or leaking, obviously that case would be removed and reprocessed. But since our equipment is generally quite good these days, there wouldn't be many of these, and so that the bottle aging is likely to be done in the case after labeling. Well, these are comments that I wanted to make on the unit operations in the winery. We've expanded our time here a bit on these, so we'll have to speak quickly on making table wines. But I don't think that's a disadvantage, because your outline, which I hope you picked up last time, if not, I have a few more copies of Chapter 8. Your outline is rather detailed, and I think I can pretty much finish what we need to say about table wines by referring to the outline, even though our time is getting short. First of all, the considerations in making table wines are pretty much what we've already been talking about, and we will distinguish table wines from sparkling wine and dessert wines in later discussions. But generally speaking, since table wines are the wine of most interest, most production these days, much of what we've had to say in unit operations applies directly to making table wines. A couple of points might be worth making. In the first place, making of table wines is not a very expensive or complicated operation, or at least need not be. You can, of course, have a very modern and expensive winery, but it's expensive largely because of scale. It is possible to have a very, very small winery or even make wine at home quite well if you're making only table wines. If you start making other kinds of wines, then you need other equipment and it can become expensive. As a consequence, wineries may be rather small and inexpensive, and this I think is quite good because relatively speaking you can start a table wine business with relatively little capital, and if you have the artistic soul and a green thumb from a technological viewpoint, you can make excellent table wines with relatively little operation, and this is good because there are many little wineries that got their start this way, and some grew into rather sizable wineries, and it helps add to the fun of the business that you may be able to scout around, find a winery that's essentially undiscovered, and buy the wine there, and by a little effort on your part then serve very good wine at relatively inexpensive prices, although these days it's hard to find it inexpensive, because you were one of the people to recognize quality and didn't necessarily buy labels in the liquor store. The sequence of operation is as noted on your sheet, and I will explain what that box has to do with things which may confuse you otherwise. The sequence is about as we have discussed already. You'd harvest the grapes, obviously, transport to the winery, crush and destam, add sulfur dioxide at the crusher if possible, certainly as soon as possible. Mix well so the sulfur dioxide is distributed throughout the must, pump to a tank or fermenter. And then there's where the drain, hold, question mark, or press comes in. If you're making a white wine, you may make a white wine from red grapes even, because with a few rare exceptions, the color of grapes is all in the skins. If you cut a grape open, you will find that the color is confined, with the exception of a few varieties, to the skin itself. And the juice, of course, obviously mostly comes from the pulp. So if you are careful, it is possible to squeeze juice from red grapes under some circumstances that is white, and you can make white wine from it. And as a consequence of that fact, although we don't commonly do that in this country, it is done some places, Champagne particularly, the white juice is used for white wine, so that you would remove the pumice immediately if you're going to make a white wine, particularly if you're going to make it from red grapes. And even from white grapes, ordinarily the quick, immediate separation of juice is what you want. You might hold for a short period of time just to get a better juice yield, but think of it in making white wine as immediate draining and pressing as soon as you've destemmed and crushed. And then the must is the juice, and you ferment for the white wine. Then you'd inoculate, complete the tumultuous and finished fermentations, and go ahead through the rest of the operations for your white wine. On the red, on the other hand, since the color is confined to the skins, and since when you press the juice out you don't get that color, then obviously you must do something to get the red color into the red wine. And what you do commonly, or at least the most common method, and will remain so for some time I think, is to ferment the whole crushed grape. The skins are fermented with the juice, and as the fermentation occurs, the CO2 kills the cells of the grape skin, and the alcohol helps kill the cells of the grape skin. And once the cells are dead, then the red color will bleed out into the solution, so that you then would get red solution and red wine. So that the draining and pressing would occur after a portion of the fermentation for red wine and before any fermentation for the white wine. And this is the point of considerable importance that I want you to get from that diagram. With white table wines, you would generally prefer to emphasize the fruity style of wine. You generally want as light a color as you can produce, a light yellow to straw color, rather than a dark amber or brownish or even sometimes golden color, although again, depending on the style, if the color is bright golden and the particular wine calls for that, then that may be possible. But as a rule, you want as light color as you can get and only a slight yellowness. In order to get this color, then, one of your special considerations is that you must avoid oxidation, browning, and darkening of this color. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Examples of varieties and the climatic region where they do well are given on your sheet, and I won't go through these, but I think you should read them over and get some idea of the types that we would consider good. Chardonnay is a very quick ripening grape. You'd grow it in early ripening grape, grow it in region 1 or 2, and Riesling also fairly early and would do well in regions 1 or 2. Whereas you see French Colombard is a very tart grape and does well in the warmer regions. So it would be very significant where you wanted to grow the grapes for the table wine. Generally speaking, as we've already said, the very hot regions, 4 or 5, don't make as good a table wine as regions 1, 2, or 3. On the other hand, if you must make table wine there, as sometimes you must, certainly with the present marketing situation, then you should be sure you pick a variety that will retain its acid well, like French Colombard or possibly Emerald Riesling. You should avoid many of the table fruit varieties like Malaga, and although Thompson Seedless can make a surprisingly good wine under some circumstances, we couldn't call it a prestige wine grape. There aren't any varietally labeled Thompson Seedless wines on the market, even though there is a good deal of Thompson Seedless wine. Palomino is another example that is generally should be avoided for table wines, although it makes good sherry, and certain others like Sauvignon Vert. Part of the reason they should be avoided is they're very difficult to press. They tend to be pulpy and hard to press, and Palomino tends to be very low in acid. So for these reasons, there are certain ones that should be avoided. I think the best rule you can go by is generally the table grapes should be avoided. They tend to be low in acid, not very high in sugar, tend to be hard to press, and so forth, and don't make really excellent table wines, although they may make fairly satisfactory standard table wines. Now, among the special considerations, we should pick the grapes as soon as possible, as soon as they reach 20 to 23 degrees Brix, so that we retain as much acid as possible. And I think it's still true that in California more errors are made by letting the grapes stay too long, get too sweet, but also too flat for making the best possible table wine from them. And since we've been shifting from a very high percentage of dessert and appetizer wines toward more and more table wines, some winemakers and some vineyard growers, vineyard operators haven't yet quite realized this, so that I think, generally speaking, the errors are on letting the grapes get too ripe and therefore too low in acid for the best quality wine, at least in the hotter sections. Of course, there is a pressure on the grape grower because often he's paid for his grapes on the sugar content. So obviously, if he isn't docked generally for low acid, although in some cases he may be. So for that reason, he tends to want to get them as sweet as he can. Now, we mentioned, and we'll now reiterate, that browning and oxidation is the most serious problem with white table wines. And in order to prevent this, you should add 75 to 150 parts per million of SO2 as soon as possible in the wine making, as we've already discussed. However, it's easy to overdo the SO2 because the delicate flavors of the white wine, the odor, the bad odor of the SO2 will be more readily recognized. So a typical fault of white table wines is excessive SO2. So you have the problem of you must use some early to prevent browning, but you must be careful you don't overdo it. We recommend fermentation at 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit for best quality, and certainly over 80 definitely damages the quality of this kind of wine. These wines tend to have protein and problems, clarity defective because of protein hazes, and therefore they would use certain kinds of fining to remove proteins, generally not the protein fining agents, but bentonite, for instance. And the aging may well be none, particularly for the standard price wines, and maybe then more for certain varieties and certain types of wine, like Chardonnay, for example. In order to prevent browning and oxidation, besides the SO2 addition, you have to pay extra attention in the storage. In other words, you should use, if you use stainless steel tanks, the headspace should be kept full with nitrogen or carbon dioxide, and every possible precaution made to avoid oxygen contact with the wine. not just because it might go to vinegar, which is a good reason to avoid oxygen contact, but because chemically the oxygen will react with the wine, make it browner, make it changed in flavor, and not as good as it would be if it were fresher, more fruity, and not oxidized. Red table wines have a greater diversity in that there are more mature dinner-type wines among the red than among the white, as opposed to the young, fruity picnic style. On the other hand, again, both exist. And again, examples of varieties and regions are given, with Cabernet Sauvignon being good in regions 1 to 3, but not very good in regions 4 to 5. And if you look down the list, there is no variety that we really can recommend strongly for region 5 to make red table wine. Probably Ruby Cabernet is the best we can suggest at this stage, but region 5 washes out the color. The red color wouldn't be good, the acidity would be low, and it's just very difficult to make a really good red table wine from region 5. So that generally you should avoid your vineyard being there. You certainly should avoid grapes like the Mission, which has very low red color, or any other low red variety, particularly in a hot region. Now, in terms of special considerations with red wines, the main consideration after we've harvested, notice that we harvest a little bit riper, recommending 21 to 23, so the upper limit is the same, but the lower limit is just a little bit higher. Generally, red grapes, the red wines are just a little higher in alcohol. The SO2 may be on a minimum side a little bit higher because you're going to have more oxygen contact in making red wine, but the maximum shouldn't be any higher than with white. And then we come to the fermentation on the skins. And we've mentioned this already, but this is a crucial and important part of making red table wines. You ferment the grapes, the whole crushed grapes, with the fluid for 3 to 4 days as a usual thing. And during this time, you'll need to undergo cap management. If this is the fermenter, your grape skins will rise to the top and will make a layer on the top of the wine, which we would call the cap. And through this layer, the carbon dioxide will come off. So if you look at a fermenting red wine, you'll see little areas where the CO2 is coming through, a lot of bubbles, but the majority of the cap will be fairly firm. In fact, in a big tank, it's possible to get out and walk on it, although I don't recommend it. You might fall through and get a pretty red bath, and it might even get a CO2 gassing. But in any case, it is a firm cap. Now, the reason this cap occurs is the CO2 tends to buoy the caps up, and they tend to be less dense and float anyway. So they're likely to float clear up out of the solution. Now, the color's in the skins. If you don't get the color from the skins to the fluid, you don't have a satisfactory red wine. So we must manage this cap so we get the red color from the skin into the fluid. And the way we do this is to either punch the cap down, punch it down into the solution with a board or any sort of a plunger, and we should do that a minimum of twice a day, twice every 24 hours, so that we keep the cap wet and keep it mixed with the solution. The other way we can do it is to draw fluid off and pump it over the top. So you can have a pump and a man with a hose, and he's spraying the wine over the top of the cap to make sure it stays wet, which of course is more practical in a large-scale operation with a big tank. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, you said oxidation was a problem, and here you are going to spray the wine over the top. It looks like that produces a lot of oxidation. Well, at the time you do it, there's so much carbon dioxide being formed, and there's carbon dioxide in the wine that you're pumping over. As a consequence, you're sweeping away the air, and if you do it at this early stage only during the rapid fermentation, then you need not be too concerned about picking up oxygen. So these are the two ways to keep the cap wet. And it's important to keep the cap wet for these 3 to 4 days, and then the fluid is drawn off. If you draw the fluid off any later than 3 to 4 days, the wine is going to be too tannic because you'll extract too much tannin from the skins and from the seeds that are likely to be on the bottom. So too long a time, the wine is too tannic. Too short a time, it's not red enough. And if you draw it off in 24 to 36 hours, that's a way to make a rosé or a pink wine. So a pink wine, the fluid's removed in 24 to 36 hours. A red wine, 3 to 4 days. And this is the way we get the proper red color. I'll have to quit at that point. There are a couple of other reasons for managing the cap properly, and I'll come back to those next time.